And now it's my pleasure to introduce you Matti Miestamo, a well-known typologist from the University of Helsinki. And he's particularly interested in negation. And now he is going to give a talk on Caritives in standard negation. Matti, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. It's very nice to be part of this conference. Of course, we were planning to have it a little bit differently, and it would have been so nice to, be able to come there and all that. But we'll cope with the circumstances, and this is good exchange this way too. So I will try to share my screen. Okay, now I'm getting interesting. Now I'm getting strange messages on the screen. I don't know. Should there be some kind of co-host thing, or how does it work? Because let's see if this is one. I can try now.
You could share it via the demonstration of the screen in the bottom.
Yeah, I know, but it just looked different than it usually does. This is strange. Now I need to give some permissions. This has never. I mean, I've shared screens in Zoom many times. This has never happened before. This is strange. Oh, okay. Now I can see the. Let's see. I'm trying again.
Yeah.
Now it works. Okay, great.
Now we can.
And now you can see it in full screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about caritives and standard negation. And well, I mean, I was invited to this conference to talk about, well, something related to my work. And of course, I don't work on caritives, on the typology of caritives. So I'm not giving you a typological overview of caritives or anything like that. And that is the sort of that's the part of your project. So when I came to this, I thought that, well, what could I contribute and what could I say about caritives? And then I, of course, thought about my own data, what I have, and I know that there are some cases where we see caritive constructions exploited in standard negation. So I thought that maybe I could just see what my database gives and what I can say on the basis of the data that I have so far. So this is a sort of overview and survey of my data of standard negation and how caritives show in that data. So I hope this perspective is also interesting for the audience and for your project. And yeah, thanks again for the invitation. It's very nice to be talking about these things here. So so I'm going to talk a little bit about the domain of negation, and then some words about previous typological studies of standard negation, then a survey of the data, of the things that I found from my database that would be relevant to the discussion of caritives. And then I will come back to standard negation in the end and try to relate a little bit to the typology of standard negation. So let's look at the domain of negation. So this is sort of subdivision of the functional domain of negation that I've used in some of my writings. So a basic distinction between clausal negation, so constructions that negate clauses, and then non-clausal negation. Under clausal negation, we have standard negation, and then we have some clause types that typically express negation in ways different from standard negation. And then we have points that require attention under non-clausal negation. So we can talk about negative replies, negative indefinites, and quantifiers.
Sorry, Matti.
Yes?
Excuse me for interrupting you, but I believe there are several of us who at the moment see only your title slide, but from the way you're speaking, I suspect that you're actually on slide 3 or something by now.
Aha, okay, it says, interesting. It says sharing is paused, bring your shared window to the front. Now I'm not, actually, I don't have access to my mouse. Can you see the slide now? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
And do you see that same slide now? Okay, so if I make it, this is very interesting. I think I'll have to share it from the PDF.
It was correct in the last time. So it was the domain of negation.
Yes, but the problem is that when okay, now it says again, sharing is paused. Okay, receive share, I'll try. No, I got, this is very strange. Can you see it now?
Yes, the domain of negation. But if you try flipping forwards or backwards.
I'm going backwards and forward. Is it the same slide all the
it's
time?
just, it's stuck on that slide.
This is very strange. Never seen this before. Sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front, but I can't get to the. Okay, I think I will. It probably has something to do with the presentation mode of Keynote. So I will. Oh, this takes some time. But what I'll have to do is I will share it from the PDF. That will probably work. So let's see. So can you see the title slide now? And is it? Oh.
Yes.
And now it's changed.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now it's from the PDF. So yeah. Okay. So Keynote didn't like the screen share option. Okay. So I was talking about the domain of negation. And this division is made for a project where we use typological data for the description of the domain of negation in individual languages, and we have, or I have designed a questionnaire for describing the domain of negation, and this is how the questionnaire is organized. There's also an overview chapter of negation in the Cambridge Handbook of Linguistic Typology, where I sort of follow the same disposition. So today we are talking about standard negation, and then how it's presented on the questionnaire. There's negative derivation, case marking, and positions, and of course caritives mainly belong to that slot in this division. So this is the questionnaire I mentioned. We produced one book on the basis of this, so negation in Uralic languages, and now we are working on that was with Anne Tam and Beata Wagner-Nagy, and now I'm working with Luba Veselina on a worldwide broad project describing the negation systems in languages from different parts of the world, 40, 50 languages included in that project. So there will be a lot of new data also on caritives when that book comes out, because the questionnaire specifically targets also that subdomain of negation. Yes, so let's look at previous studies of standard negation and caritives. So what is standard negation? Informally, you can say that standard negation is the basic means a language has for negating declarative main clauses with a verbal predicate. And then there is a more detailed comparative concept that refers to the change in truth value, that is the semantic core of negation, and then takes into account the possibility that you can't directly negate everything in a language. I will not go deeper into that comparative concept, but this is how I have defined standard negation in my work. And then we have examples from English. King Arthur was barking on the balcony. King Arthur was not barking on the balcony. King Arthur barks on the balcony. King Arthur doesn't bark on the balcony. So standard negation expressed by not or its bound form added to the finite element of the sentence in English. So this is how English negates declarative verbal main clauses in the default case. Yes. So what do we have in typological literature on standard negation? Earlier, well, people have paid attention to the type of negative marker already in the 70s, Stendhal. The term standard negation is from Payne, John Payne, from the Chopin volume from the 80s, the first Chopin volume that came out in the 80s. People have paid attention to the position of negative markers, especially Matthew Dreyer's new chapters in waltz. Well, not so new anymore, but newer than the original waltz. And then people have paid attention to the relationship of the structure of the negative to the structure of the affirmative. And this is also where I've had most of my research interest. So also a couple of chapters in waltz, and my original dissertation work, which is almost 20 years ago already. So yeah, so I'm just, I'm not going through any examples of standard negation at this point to be able to get to Caritives as soon as possible, but I'm just showing you these maps to give an idea of what there is, what has been done. So people have paid attention to the type of negative marker. Is it an affix, a particle, an auxiliary verb, or something else? Those are the three main types, particles being the most common. Then people have paid attention to the position of negative markers, and negative markers tend to occur before the verb, especially if they are free elements. In bound elements, the preference is not so clear. And then I've looked at the relationship between affirmatives and negatives. So this is one of the waltz maps where some languages show no difference between affirmatives and negatives, and in some languages there's always the construction is always such that it's not just adding a negative but something else changes. And then there are languages where there's sometimes some asymmetry, but negation can also be symmetric. And then I've distinguished a number of different subtypes of asymmetric standard negation. So I paid attention. I mean, there are types where the finiteness of the lexical verb changes. There are cases where negation has to be irrealis marked. And there are cases where the marking of grammatical categories changes in different ways. Often categories distinctions are neutralized in the negative. So the same categories distinctions are not available in the negative as in the affirmative. Okay, so standard negation is probably the subdomain of negation that has attracted most attention from typologists. I mean, it is the default, the most basic negation, so it's logical that it's the thing that people look at first, and that has been studied the most. Then if we come to the topic of this conference, Caritives. Now this, the title of the slide is how we put, or how I put it in the questionnaire in my division of the domain. So it's a little bit broader than just Caritives. It also includes other kinds of negative derivation, antonymy and things like that. But all of this is still something that people have not worked so much on. So there's little systematic work on these issues, some cross-linguistic observations by Zimmer in the 60s, but that was not based on a large systematic typological sample. I have some ongoing work with Masha Koptevska-Tam and Kalle Berstel on antonyms. Thomas Stolz has written on abessives and their relation to commutative instrumental. And then there is the current project ongoing in St. Petersburg, the Caritives project, which will now remedy this gap in typological literature and have a more systematic look at caritives. So there's a lot to be, lot to look forward to there. So this is the, I showed my definition of the of standard negation, and this is just to repeat the definition of your project of the Caritive, how you put it in your website. And of course, these are things that have been talked about during this conference many times already, so I will not repeat them here. Just give it as a background. Yeah, I mean, there isn't much more to be said about the typological work on Caritives so far, but there's a lot going on at the moment. One point when we are still in previous research, one point that I wanted to bring up is the discussion that there has been about the origin of standard negation in Arawakan. It has been proposed, shown perhaps, that in many Arawakan languages, the current standard negation construction derives from an earlier privative through some kind of insubordination construction. And of course, then we can ask to what extent are these connected to Caritives in the sense of the current project? Are they, I mean, the development is through some kind of negative converb, which is not Caritive in the proper sense, but at least in some, I mean, and it's not known what the functions in the proto-language were, but at least in some of the contemporary languages, there seem to be clear Caritive functions with the privative that also survives in parallel with standard negation. So this is one thing that has been talked about, combining standard negation and Caritives in previous literature. And now I'm going to my my survey that I did for this talk. This is, we can say that this is work in progress, but I hope to be able to give some kind of overview in any case. But this is not the final word of how these two subdomains are related. So the survey is based on a language sample that has been collected, compiled using the so-called genus macro area method that I've used in my negation work earlier, and that I also wrote a little bit more about with a couple of colleagues, Antti Arpe and Dick Bakker in Linguistic Typology some years ago, and we were comparing it to other sampling methods with similar goals in that article. This is the original sample that I had in my work on standard negation. So the sample size is 297 languages in total. But the point of the sampling method, the main point is that one should take one language from each genus, so that the languages are not, that are all genera, all groupings, genealogical groupings of that level are represented, but that languages are not too closely related to each other. And I ended up with a core sample of 240 languages then, all languages coming from different genera. I mean, of course, there are many more genera, but at that point, I was able to cover 240 of them with enough information to see how standard negation works in them. And then there were some additional languages that were added because I was also writing chapters for the WALS project, and I had to cover that sample as well. So that's why. So there are 57 languages that are not, that may belong to genera that are also already represented in the sample. And then I say it's a semi-systematic survey of caritive meanings. And what I mean by this is that when I was originally doing my work on standard negation, my very first go through of the data was to note everything that the sources said about negation. So it was a rather thorough reading of the sources. And then later, of course, I was focusing on standard negation only, but I have a lot of notes about the domain of negation, other aspects of the domain of negation. So when I was asked to look at caritives, I was able to go to my old notes and go through all of them and see what I had noted on caritives. Of course, I wasn't working on caritives then, so my attention to caritives might not have been as keen as it was on standard negation. So that's why I'm saying semi-systematic. I'm not claiming that I have captured everything that is relevant in the sample languages, but I hope it's a good overview and at least a good first exploration of the combination of these two domains. So this is just a map of how the languages are located in the world. These are all the 297 languages. Okay, so what have I been looking for? So primarily, as my title also says, I was looking for cases in which the expression of standard negation uses a caritive marker or a caritive construction. And then also perhaps connections between caritives and standard negation more broadly, if anything such was could be found. Now, of course, reading grammars of 300 languages, you will have very different terminology. So I paid attention to, of course, the examples themselves, but then especially to the sources mentioning caritives, privatives, adhesives, the meaning without or the meaning less, and things like that. So these are, as you know, people talk about these things under different names. Yes, so, and of course, if we talk about the connection between standard negation and caritives very broadly, then we can always say that there's a connection between caritive semantics and standard negation in many languages, in the sense that absence or non-involvement can easily be expressed by clausal standard negation. So taking the examples from the definition of caritives, John came without his children, we can say things like John came but his children didn't come with him, or his children were not with him. John traveled without money. John traveled but he didn't have any money. A beardless man was sitting in the corner of the room. A man was sitting in the corner of the room. The man had no beard. So obviously we can connect standard negation and caritives in this way, but this is not what this survey is about. So there's some limit to what the connections, the broad connections that I'm trying to pay attention to. There is some limit to what is relevant and what is not. Yes, so now this is the time when I'm actually going to the examples. So I'm now going through almost all languages where I found something relevant to the research question, and since I've used at least half of my time already, this perhaps tells you that there were not so many languages that actually show something interesting, but quite a few still. So the first language that I'm going to show you an example of is Khalkha, Mongolian, where, as probably most of you know, the contemporary standard negation construction is expressed with a privative suffix, a post-verbal privative marker that attaches to a nominalized form of the verb, a participial, and the A example here shows that it also has, now this is, the first example is from Juha Janhunen, and he uses the term privative here. So that follows his glossing, and the transcription or transliteration is also a little bit different. The B, C, D, E examples come from the other source, but it's the same element. Khalkha has a standard negation, an earlier archaic standard negation construction that was finite, but this was replaced by this privative or caritive based construction, where the caritive marker appears on the lexical verb that has been nominalized. So that's one clear and perhaps well-known example of such a connection. Then we go to the other side of the world, to Central America, Rama, the Egyptian language, where, well, there are actually a couple of alternative standard negation constructions. I mean, you can have several standard negation constructions in one and the same language. And Rama has, well, a couple of them. One of them uses the post-verbal marker tama, which is attached to a nominalized form of the verb, or at least the combination of the verb stem and this negative marker has nominal characteristics. It can, for example, take a nominal plural marker, which is not shown on these examples. So we have standard negation examples first, or, well, affirmative and negative, and then we can see the same marker appearing on a noun. So this is again a clear case of a marker, a nominal marker with caritive semantics that is used to express standard negation. The other standard negation constructions are more finite in this language too. So, I mean, I haven't so far had the possibility of go deeper into the diachrony of this construction, but clearly there's more to be looked at there. Chukchi is also an example that is certainly familiar to many of you. So Chukchi standard negation in all other, basically all other tense aspect mood categories than the future is expressed by this kind of construction where the well, two-part negation marker appears on the verb and nominalizes it. It's called, well, it's called in different ways in different sources. I think Dunn calls it privative, and I think in Kempfer and Volodin call it anti-commutative. But but it's used, it can be used for standard negation on its own without a finite element appearing in the clause at all. And then you have to infer the finite categories, the grammatical categories from the context, or they can be specified on a be verb. So again, we have a periphrastic construction where negation is marked on the lexical verb that loses its finiteness, and the negative marker here has caritive functions elsewhere in the language. So in example D, we can see a good example of a caritive. And here it's actually interesting when you go through all these languages. I found very often that the caritive examples are about weapons. People go somewhere without a gun or a spear or a bow, or they go somewhere they leave the house without a gun or something like that. So this is obviously something that people need to talk about when they go out in the wild. Okay, then we go to another continent, Caritives in Australia. Caritives again has, well, most of its standard negation, or its, let's say, most salient standard negation construction is a part of the tense aspect mood paradigm, verbal marking, inflectional verbal marking. But then, and those are finite categories, but then we also have privative, which using the term that, that Evans uses. This privative or caritive, clearly, as you can see in B, it has the caritive function that we are interested in here. Again, it's about weapons. So sorry, the A example, of course. This is the going around without a weapon. And then in the B example, we can see this same privative in a clausal negation function. And whether we can say this is standard negation is not entirely clear. In my work, I've analyzed this as standard negation because it's semantically, there is no clear semantic distinction between negation marked with this privative to the more common salient standard negation construction. And also this is completely productive according to the source, and the semantic difference is subtle, if any. And then there are also some tense aspect mood categories that don't have direct equivalence in the other standard negation paradigm. So those can then be negativized with this privative construction. So that also speaks for taking it as standard negation. But of course, from the point of view of Caritive, it's not crucial whether we say standard negation or not. It's but it's the interesting point is that this marker is employed in expressing clausal negation, be it standard or not. Okay, then we go to New Guinea, and this and we look at asmat, which is which has a negative marker that can also follow nouns with the meaning without. If we look at the standard negation example in C, we can see that the verb gets an intentional prefix, which makes it dependent to some extent, so it's not a fully finite form. And then this negator appears after it. So comparing it to the B example, the affirmative example, we can see that it has lost its finiteness and there's a new finite element added. The D example is there to show that actually there is an affirmative with which this negative is symmetric. So the asymmetry is actually in what is available in the paradigm and not in the construction. You just add the negative marker on the intentional future affirmative. And then this same marker in a little bit different form, it's also a different source, so the vowel is different, but this or in the beginning is actually it depends on the phonological context. So it is the same marker. So there we can see it expressing a privative, a caritive meaning, men without possessions, and then maybe more lexically poor men. Okay, so that is still a case where we can say that there is a nominal, that the verb is nominalized, and we have a caritive marker that attaches to a nominal form in the same way as it does on nouns. Then when we go to Imonda, which is also a language of New Guinea, there we have the marker hoi, which is a negator that appears on verbs. It follows the verb stem, but it doesn't really nominalize the form. There's nothing in the verb that indicates that it would be a dependent or nominalized form. But the same marker can then also appear after nouns to make a caritive meaning, foodless, womanless, meaning a single man, or in the C example, in a clausal context, stay without food, and then we have a standard negation example in D, where it performs verbal negation. Imonda also has a couple of other standard negation constructions as well, but hoi is also productive, and there's no clear indication that it would be secondary to the others. So I also analyze the hoi construction as standard negation. Here there is no corresponding affirmative to show the exactly how the structure relates to it. Then we have an example from Yukagir where it is indicated in the source that the negative prefix that expresses standard negation can also form a caritive or pivotive function. And often it's followed by a suffix that has privative, that is glossed as privative here in B. So this is now rather a case of a standard negator being involved in the expression of the caritive, rather than a caritive marker performing standard negation. So we're going further away from those typical examples where the verb is nominalized and then it gets a caritive marker. Goniandi from Australia has, if we look at example D, we can see that a standard negation is usually marked with this marker Mangardi. But then there's another negator that has the, well, it's translated in the source by nothing or without, and it can appear on nouns in a caritive function. And it's interesting to sort of think about its relation to clausal negation and standard negation, because we have examples like B, where it very much looks like it's making a clausal negation construction, but the author of the grammar, Bill McGregor, says very clearly that these examples that look like this should be analyzed as elliptic. There is some noun that this marker attaches to. This noun is elliptic, and then it looks like there is a that it's a clausal negator, or in this B case, it should be analyzed as some kind of adverb meaning never or something like that. So in his analysis, it's not a clausal negation marker.
Matti, sorry, you have got 10 minutes left.
Okay, thanks. Yes. Interestingly, there is another, I don't have an example of it, but there's another marker that functions in a very similar way. Vuorolan or something like that. I don't have the example right now here on this slide. It's used in a taboo variant of the language, and it has both of these functions. So it functions as a caritive as marlami, and it functions as a standard negator as mangaddi. So it's an interesting case of a taboo language form combining these two functions that this marlami marker doesn't have clearly, at least. And then another Australian language which has a standard negator, preverbal standard negator that, as we can see in B, that can then also function as a caritive, meaning without, often with an additional suffix. Yeah, but maybe no need to say more about that. Then we have Khmer, which where you can also find where it's also reported that a negator that can perform clausal negation, perhaps standard negation, can also function as a caritive marker. A and B show the regular standard negation construction in this language, preverbal particle min, but then there's another marker, Khmian, which is actually a negative form of a have verb. So the K is the negator and Mian is the have verb originally. And it is, it can perform a caritive function as we see in D, and then according to the source in spoken language is also often used for clausal negation. And if it is a productive marker, Khmer has several productive markers of standard negation, and if it is one of those in spoken language, then at least in the spoken variant, we could say that there's a connection. It's originally a negative have verb, so it's not originally a caritive and it's not originally a standard negator, but it has a different origin, but it has come to be used, at least according to this source, in both functions. Then another interesting example, again, Kanela Kraho from South, we go to South America again, to the Amazon region. The standard negator is a post-verbal clause final marker, nare, and we can see then that it also, and again we are talking about doing things without a weapon. So this is a recurrent pattern. At least some generalization from this work can be drawn. So we have an example where the same marker appears after a nominal. The source is explicitly talks about negating the instrument, but it appears that this marker can appear on different constituents. So I'm not, I mean, here it appears to perform a caritive function, but to what extent is it a caritive marker, and to what extent it's a more general constituent negator that can appear on almost anything, that would need to be paid more attention to. And finally, the last example is from Vintu, where I don't have a caritive example to give you, but I just want to draw your attention to the negative auxiliary that performs standard negation. So in the B and D examples, you can see this elev marker, which is a negative auxiliary that inflects for person at least. And the final element, the W, the W there, is said to be originate in a well, again, the source talks about privative, and what the actual semantics of that marker in an earlier form of the language would be, that's unclear. But this is again one indication and of a connection, and this relates also to what was said about Arawakan earlier. So another case where negative marking originates in a privative caritive, and well, this probably then has had some nominal elements, some nominal characteristics at an earlier stage, this now negative auxiliary. So that's the survey of the different examples that I found interesting. So this is not a systematic typological study that will give you numbers and percentages, because the languages that show something interesting in the combination of these domains is rather low. So it's more like looking at individual cases and going deeper into them than in subsequent work. I have, how many minutes do I have now?
Well, you have 3 minutes, but you can take some minutes from the questions. Okay,
very briefly, coming back to the typology of standard negation, and I'm sure there are many people in the audience who've heard me talk about standard negation earlier, and I'm not going to go through all my typology in 3 minutes, don't be afraid of that. Just point to some things here. So the basic distinction I've made is between symmetric and asymmetric negation. Symmetric negation is where you just add a negative marker and nothing else changes. So in these examples, there's just a negative particle added in taba, or a negative suffix added in wash. And then we have asymmetric constructions where there are differences. So in Jola-Fogni, the future marking of tense differs. It's a portmanteau negative future. And in Maka, the finiteness of the verbal elements change. We get a negative auxiliary, and then the lexical verb loses its finiteness. So we have symmetric and asymmetric negation. We also have paradigms, symmetric and asymmetric, which is about whether you can negate everything in a one-to-one relation, or whether the paradigms are organized differently. I will not talk more about that here. There are different types of asymmetry that I've distinguished, and I will certainly not go through all of these. The most important and interesting subtype here is, of course, subtype that I've called subtype afin neg LV, meaning that the finiteness of the lexical verb is lost or reduced, and the negative marker appears on the lexical verb. So this is the kind of thing that we have in Apalai, where the negative marker is a deverbalizing element on the lexical verb, and then we get a new finite element to carry subject, person, and tense. And there are some other examples, Chukchi again. This is where this type is found in the languages of the world. Now, I have some slides here that I wasn't planning to go through at all, only if there had been a lot of extra time. But I want to sort of point out that, of course, as I've said, it's not very common that we find something where these two domains come together, but there are interesting examples. And of course, the most probable cases are these affine and neg-LV constructions, where we have a periphrastic construction where negation is marked on the lexical verb. And as we saw, most of the cases that I could extract from my data were such cases. But interestingly, there were quite some examples of another type as well. So there is more to be explored in the combination of these two domains than just looking at those periphrastic nominalized constructions. So that's the types of standard negatives involved. Then what types of caritives are involved, that's something I'll leave to your project and your future typology of caritives. So I'm not going to say more about that. I had some examples of Finnish, but we have, so these are not standard negation. This is standard negation in Finnish. So we have a negative auxiliary that is inflected in person, and then the lexical verb loses its finiteness. But then we can also use the abessive case, which has caritive functions. So the last example here, Jussi matkusti rahatta, John traveled, or Jussi traveled without money, is a clear caritive in this sense. And then we can do clausal negation with the same case. So olin lukematta koko illan. I didn't read for the whole evening. I spent the whole evening without reading. Jätin sen tekemättä. I left it undone. I didn't do it. These are clearly not standard negation because they have special semantics, special pragmatic context, but they are clausal negation. And it's interesting to, I mean, if we just focus on standard negation, we will not see all cases where caritives can perform clausal negation, of course. And then I had another case from called Sami, which is very similar, but then the negative converb is actually not a caritive. There's a different caritive, which is the abessive case in the last two examples, and in the first example where we have the clausal negation, the verbal abessive. This is how it's called in the grammar of this language. Often it's a negative converb that doesn't have caritive functions. So there are different, but it has similar functions as the Finnish construction. So we have rather close, well, not so closely related, but close, at least geographically close languages that have similar constructions with similar semantics and pragmatics, but they arrange them differently in the larger frame of their grammars. And then I was just going to note that one thing that we've paid attention to in negatives, especially explaining and understanding the asymmetries in standard negation, why some languages lose distinctions in the negative. One idea that I've proposed as a motivation is the discourse context of negatives. So negatives typically occur in contexts where the corresponding affirmative is supposed, or at least somehow present. So there's reason to use negation. So if somebody says, oh, King Arthur didn't bite anyone, then if there hadn't been any talk about King Arthur biting people or anything, that possibility in the air, then the interlocutor would perhaps react in a strange way and say, oh, why are you saying that? Does he usually do that? So there has to be a reason to negate. So they typically occur in contexts where the corresponding affirmative is somehow in the air. And I guess this goes for caritives as well. We say that he left the house without a gun or without the spare because it's dangerous outside, and you know, you're not expected to do that, maybe. So then, of course, whether this can be somehow employed in explaining the different types of caritives in later research, that's another question. But at least caritives pattern with negation, I mean, it's the same similar pragmatic reasons for using caritives as for other negation. And yeah, I'm going to stop here now. I guess I went already 5 minutes over time, but
very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. So we have some minutes for questions. Maxim.
Yes, thank you so much for the lecture. I had a small question about Skoltsami, about this form, this verbal aversive. Is this construction, the first example, the only context it is used in, or is it also attributively used as unnoticed or unburned in English?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not the only use for this. I mean, it does have uses, negative converbial uses more generally. So this kind of sort of equivalent of main clause negation, as it is in this first example, is certainly not its typical use. More like it's a well, rather regular negative converb used in similar contexts as negative converbs are in languages, and then it can also be used in this way. So actually, yeah, it could be very well glossed as negative converb. Verbal aversive is the traditional gloss for it, and it may be that kind of glossing is somewhat confusing also, as it sounds more specific or more strange than it actually is.
So this gloss isn't anyhow diachronically motivated. It's not coming from any caritive or aversive marker in the past.
Not that I know. No.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
But if there is a uralisis to confirm this, I mean, I've done work on Skoltsami myself, but I come to Skoltsami as a typologist, and I don't have the the deep diachronic knowledge of Sami languages. So don't take my word as the final truth.
Thank you. So we have 1 minute for a real small question, if somebody, or a comment on observation, if somebody wants to add something. Sonia, is it you?
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Well, I'll try to say my comment shortly. Studying caritives, we have a problem, or I don't know, that very often caritives are expressed with the same means as negative existentials. And as far as I understood, in your data that you presented, there are also cases when it's not just a dedicated caritive marker that is used in clausal negation, but it may be also a negative existential marker that is used in clausal negation, as it is the case of Gunyandi, if I'm not mistaken. And well, I'm wondering whether you know about cases, about languages where there is a dedicated caritive marker, which is different from negative existential, but which is used, which can be used as a part of standard negation construction.
So the dedicated caritive marker, which is different from the negative existential. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't, if we think about some of these examples. Yeah, because I didn't, I haven't looked at the relationship between negative existential and these caritive markers systematically. So I'm not sure to what extent all of these are involved in the marking of negative existence. At least they are not, you know, yeah, I mean, I should go back to all these sources but of course these are rather few languages, so it's not a very difficult task to do it and go through them. But yeah, I mean, I can't give you a completely certain answer on that.
Yeah, but thank you very much for all the examples.